3 most creepy travel horror stories. The idea had been Ethan's. It was always Ethan's idea to do something wild, something off the grid. A road trip to an isolated cabin, he'd said, was just the escape they all needed. At first, it sounded exciting, different. But as the car rattled down the narrow gravel road, Mallory's enthusiasm had all but vanished. The trees pressed in closer the further they went, their gnarled branches arching over the road like claws reaching for the car. The headlights barely pierced through the suffocating darkness. Mallory clutched the strap of her bag tighter, her unease growing with every bump and turn. "Chloe?" Ethan said, leaning forward, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You sure this is the right way?" Chloe, sitting in the passenger seat, stared at her phone, the faint glow illuminating her furrowed brow. "I think so," she murmured, though her voice wavered. "The directions said to keep going until the road opens up. It should be soon." "Should be," Jake muttered from the back seat, his usual sarcasm laced with tension. "Great." "Not helping," Mallory whispered, her eyes fixed on the looming forest outside her window. It felt alive somehow, like it was watching them, waiting. The car jolted as they hit another rut, and finally, the clearing came into view. The cabin stood there, hunched and weathered, its wooden walls sagging under the weight of time. A single weak porch light flickered against the thick darkness. "Well," Jake said, forcing a laugh, "it's, cozy?" Mallory stepped out of the car and shivered as the icy night air wrapped around her. The silence was deafening. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves. Just, nothing. She turned toward the trees, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move, a shadow darting between the trunks. She blinked. It was gone. Inside, the cabin wasn't much better. The air was damp, heavy, and carried the faint scent of mildew. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare. A small fireplace crackled in the corner, its flames weak and barely warming the room. "This is fine," Ethan said, forcing a grin. "We'll make it work. It's just for the weekend." But as night fell, the unease settled in. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows like ghostly fingers tapping against the glass. The wooden floors creaked with every step, even when no one was walking. Mallory lay awake in the darkness, her heart racing. And then she heard it, a faint tapping. Tap, tap. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Ethan," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Listen," she hissed. They both stayed silent, straining to hear. The sound came again. Soft, deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. "It's probably just a branch," Ethan muttered, though his voice was tight. Mallory wasn't convinced. She slid out of bed, her movements slow and deliberate, and crept to the window. Her trembling fingers pulled the curtain back just enough to peek outside. Her heart stopped. At the edge of the clearing, barely illuminated by the faint moonlight, was a figure. It was tall, far too tall, and its limbs were unnaturally thin, almost stretched. It stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly, as though it knew she was watching. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice cracking. He joined her at the window, his face pale as he caught sight of the figure. And then, it moved. A single slow step backward into the shadows of the trees. Morning brought no relief. The cabin felt heavier, as if the walls were closing in. Chloe was the first to suggest leaving. "This place is wrong," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to go." Ethan shook his head. "Whatever it was, it's gone. We can't just leave because of some shadow." Mallory didn't argue, but the pit in her stomach grew deeper. By nightfall, the whispers began. Low, guttural murmurs that seemed to come from the forest itself. At first, Mallory thought she was imagining it, but then she saw the others, how their faces paled, how their bodies stiffened, They heard it too. "Do you hear that?" Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded, his eyes wide. "What is that?" Mallory's chest tightened as the whispers grew louder, surrounding the cabin, seeping through the cracks in the walls. And then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Crunch, crunch. The sound of someone, or something, walking just outside. "Pack your stuff," Ethan said, his voice low and urgent. "We're leaving! Now!" They scrambled to gather their things, their movements frantic. But as they stepped onto the porch, the whispers stopped. The silence was suffocating. Mallory's hands shook as she climbed into the car. Ethan started the engine, and the headlights cut through the darkness. The road felt longer this time, the forest closing in on them with every passing second. Mallory couldn't bring herself to look out the window, but something made her glance in the rearview mirror. Her stomach dropped. At the edge of the forest, barely visible in the fading glow of the taillights, stood the figure. It was watching them, its hollow gaze piercing through the darkness. It didn't move. It didn't need to. Even as they sped away, Mallory couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that whatever it was, it would find them again. And deep down, she knew. It was only a matter of time. This is very terrifying. Travel horror story number 2. Every summer, Bailey and her younger brother Caleb would pack up their bags and hit the road. It was their tradition. This year, they decided to take Highway 87. It was an old, forgotten stretch of road, the kind that didn't appear on any tourist map. Bailey had read a few things online about it, but she wasn't the superstitious type. Highway 87, the timeless road, some people called it. They said the towns along the way were stuck in the past. Others claimed time itself didn't work right there. Time would stretch, and sometimes people would come back from it, only to find that hours had passed, days even. But Bailey didn't believe in that. This was just another adventure. The car was packed, and Caleb was already plugged into his headphones, probably scrolling through some random app. He had a way of zoning out, but Bailey liked the quiet. The kind of quiet you could only find on a forgotten highway. But as the sun dipped behind the trees and the road ahead faded into the deepening night, something started to feel off. It wasn't anything she could point to, not at first. The silence, the emptiness of the road. Maybe it was just the dark, the woods stretching on either side, deep, thick, and unyielding, their shadows reaching out like long fingers. "Are we almost there?" Caleb asked, glancing up from his phone. Bailey checked the time. "Yeah, we've been on the road for about an hour. Another 30 minutes, I think." "Right," Caleb muttered, but he didn't look convinced. He was getting antsy. The radio buzzed, the static cutting in and out, but there was nothing on the dial. Just nothing. Bailey tried not to think about it. "It's just old equipment," she told herself, "nothing more." But it wasn't just the radio. After another half hour, Bailey glanced at the dashboard again. The clock was stuck at 9:47. She frowned, double-checking. Still 9:47. That wasn't right. "Caleb," she started, trying to sound casual, but her voice was tight. Do you see the time?" Caleb looked up and squinted at the dashboard. "It's stuck. What's going on?" Bailey's pulse quickened. She reached for the map in the glove box. But something about the paper, its edges curled and crinkled like it had aged in a way it shouldn't have, felt wrong. She forced herself to focus. "It's just a glitch. The car's old, okay? Just needs a reset." But Caleb wasn't convinced. "I don't like this, Bailey. What if we're going in circles?" That thought hit her like a cold wave. She glanced in the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind them. Just the endless stretch of road. "Let's pull over, stretch our legs. Maybe we'll snap out of this weird vibe," Bailey suggested, trying to shake off the unease. The moment the car stopped, the air felt heavier, thick, like it was pushing in from all sides. "I don't hear anything," Caleb whispered, his voice laced with that nervous energy. "That's the point," Bailey replied, her voice much quieter now. No wind, no animals, no crickets. Everything around them was still, no sound, just the weight of the world hanging over them. Bailey tried to focus on something, anything. She pulled out her phone. No signal. "Great," Caleb said, exhaling sharply. "We're stuck." "Let's keep going," Bailey said, forcing a calmness into her voice. "We're fine. It's just the place." But when they got back into the car and started driving again, the road didn't seem to change. It was like they were driving through a never-ending tunnel. No signs, no exits, just darkness. It was a little after an hour when they saw it, a single flickering light in the distance. Bailey squinted through the windshield. A diner? The sign barely glowed, buzzing and flickering like it had been out of use for years. "Finally," she murmured, relief flooding through her. She pulled into the empty parking lot, her headlights casting a pale glow across the cracked asphalt. The bell above the diner's door jingled as they entered. Inside, the diner was dark, with just a few dim lights casting long shadows on the walls. It smelled stale, like time had forgotten this place. Behind the counter, a woman stood. Her back was to them, but as they stepped closer, she turned slowly, her eyes too wide, too still. Her smile, it didn't seem right. "Hello?" Bailey greeted, trying to sound normal. "Take a seat," the woman said, her voice too smooth, too empty. They chose a booth in the corner. There was no menu, just 2 mugs of coffee already placed on the table. Bailey didn't trust it. "This is weird," Caleb said, his voice hushed. She nodded, her gut telling her the same thing. The air felt too thick here, like it was pressing on her from all sides. When the waitress came over, she set the mugs down with a disturbing calmness. "Coffee?" she asked, her tone clipped and cold. Bailey tried not to shiver. Just black. When the waitress turned to leave, Bailey couldn't help but feel watched. Bailey took a sip. It was wrong. The taste hit her tongue like bitter metal. She set it down immediately. "This is terrible." Caleb pushed his aside too, grimacing. "Let's get out of here," Bailey said, standing quickly. Caleb followed, both of them eager to leave the strange, suffocating atmosphere of the diner behind. They left cash on the counter, barely a word exchanged. But when they turned to leave, Bailey saw something that froze her blood. In the window, the waitress was standing, watching them. Her eyes never blinked. Her smile, wider now, more unsettling. Bailey's breath caught in her throat. Back on the road, the tension was unbearable. "Bailey, I feel like we're being followed," Caleb whispered, his voice trembling. "Just keep your eyes on the road," she replied, her own voice tight. But Caleb's words struck a chord. The road seemed endless, the trees closing in, their branches like long, gnarled hands reaching for the car. The headlights barely seemed to cut through the dark anymore. The air felt thick and wrong. Suddenly, Caleb gasped. "Bailey, stop! There's someone!" She slammed on the brakes. A figure stood in the middle of the road, the woman from the diner. Bailey's heart slammed in her chest. Her hands shook. "Go! Go!" Caleb screamed. Bailey didn't need to be told twice. She hit the gas, but when she looked back, the woman was gone. And the trees, were they moving? The car started to sputter. The engine went dead. Bailey slammed her palm on the wheel, trying to start it again. Nothing. Then, tapping. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the roof. Bailey froze, her blood running cold. "Did you hear that?" Caleb's face went pale. "It's not the wind." The tapping was faster now, louder. Bailey slowly, almost reluctantly, turned her head to look out the window. A shadow moved outside, something tall, something watching them. And then, the tapping stopped. Dead silence. Bailey's breath was shallow. "We need to get out of here." They opened the car doors, their footsteps crunching on the gravel as they stepped into the cold, heavy air. The tapping started again, slowly, deliberately. Bailey's heart hammered in her chest as the sound grew louder, closer, and then, footsteps. Heavy, uneven steps. They weren't alone. "Run!" Bailey gasped. They didn't hesitate. The footsteps followed. This is most creepy. Travel horror story number 3. It was supposed to be an adventure. Hesper loved road trips. Always had. There was something intoxicating about the open road, the way it promised freedom and discovery. So when her GPS suggested a scenic detour through the Appalachian backcountry, she didn't think twice. "Why not?" she murmured to herself, glancing at the sign that read, "Meadow Ridge, 15 miles. A small town, probably cozy. Maybe even a hidden gem where she could grab dinner before continuing her journey. It sounded perfect. At first, the drive felt like a dream. The road snaked through rolling hills bathed in golden sunlight, with mountains standing tall in the distance like silent guardians. Hesper rolled the windows down, breathing in the crisp air as the car hummed along the smooth pavement. She was alone, but it was the kind of solitude that felt peaceful, until the sun began its slow descent behind the horizon. As dusk settled in, the scenery started to shift. The open fields and soft light gave way to thick, looming woods. The trees seemed to press closer to the road, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The sky, once warm and inviting, turned an inky blue. Hesper turned her headlights on. She didn't realize she was gripping the steering wheel tighter until her knuckles ached. Her GPS crackled suddenly, the calm, robotic voice instructing her to turn left, then cutting off mid-sentence. She frowned, glancing at her phone. "No signal?" she muttered, her voice breaking the tense silence in the car. A pit began to form in her stomach. "It's just a patch of bad service. You'll be fine," she told herself. She forced a deep breath, trying to shake the unease that prickled at the edges of her mind. The woods. They were just woods. Trees, shadows. Nothing more. But the road began to change. The smooth pavement she'd been cruising on became cracked, riddled with potholes and scattered debris. The further she went, the worse it got. Her car jolted over the uneven surface, and she had to slow down just to navigate safely. Her headlights swept across the dark forest, but beyond their beam, everything was swallowed in blackness. And then, she saw it. A massive tree sprawled across the road like some ancient beast, its roots twisted and exposed, as if it had been violently ripped from the ground. She slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. Hesper's heart sank. "Great," she muttered, her voice shaking despite the forced calmness. She reached for her phone again, holding it up like that might somehow improve the non-existent signal. Nothing. She cursed under her breath, glancing in the rearview mirror. The thought of turning back, of driving those miles of dark, suffocating forest in reverse, made her throat tighten. But staying here, in the middle of nowhere, that felt worse. Then, she saw it. A faint, flickering light, deeper in the woods. Her breath caught. It wasn't the cold blue of a phone screen or flashlight. It was warm, golden, almost inviting. Relief and dread swirled in her chest. Someone's there, she thought, someone who can help. But another thought quickly followed. What if it's not? She hesitated, her fingers tapping nervously against the steering wheel. The air inside the car suddenly felt stifling. She glanced at the tree again, then back at the light. Finally, she decided. Leaving the car idling, she grabbed her flashlight and stepped out into the night. The cold hit her instantly, sharp and biting, sending a shiver down her spine. The sound of her boots crunching against gravel was deafening in the eerie silence. She walked toward the light, her flashlight cutting through the dark, but the shadows seemed alive. They danced and shifted in ways that made her question what she was seeing. The light. It seemed closer from the car. Now, it felt impossibly far. Every step felt heavier, like the forest was trying to pull her back. The trees loomed above her, their branches like claws reaching for the sky. Every now and then she thought she heard something, a rustle, a faint snap of a twig. Her heart pounded against her ribs. When she finally reached the source of the light, she froze. A cabin stood before her, its roof sagging under years of neglect. Warm light glowed softly from its windows, and a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. It should have looked welcoming. It didn't. The air here felt heavier, charged with something she couldn't name. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No answer. She climbed the creaking porch steps, each groan of the wood beneath her feet making her wince. She knocked lightly on the door, forcing her voice to stay steady. I'm stuck on the road. A tree's blocking the way and I could use some help." Silence. Just as she turned to leave, the door creaked open. Slowly. Her breath hitched. The warm light from the windows didn't extend inside. The cabin's interior was a black void. A faint metallic smell wafted out, sharp and sickly. It made her stomach churn. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run. But something, curiosity, desperation, kept her rooted in place. She stepped inside. The air was suffocating, thick with a presence she couldn't explain. Her flashlight's beam flickered, catching glimpses of the room, a wooden table, a single chair, a fireplace filled with cold ash. Then she heard it. A faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from deeper in the cabin. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her palms were damp. The tapping stopped. And then, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving toward her. Her flashlight jerked wildly as she spun around, the beam catching a figure emerging from the shadows. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its movements impossibly smooth. Its face was obscured, swallowed by darkness, but she could feel its gaze, piercing, invasive, like it was peeling back every layer of her being. Hesper's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the floor. Her survival instincts kicked in. She turned and ran. The cabin seemed to stretch endlessly, the door impossibly far. She could hear it behind her, the sound of those deliberate, unhurried footsteps. When she finally burst onto the porch, the forest around her was unrecognizable. The path was gone. The road was gone. Only trees remained, towering and endless. The footsteps followed her out. Hesper ran, branches tearing at her skin, her lungs burning. She didn't dare look back. The sound of the footsteps was growing louder, closer. Her legs screamed for relief, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Suddenly, the trees opened up, and she stumbled onto the road. Headlights blinded her, and the screech of tires filled the air as a car skidded to a halt. "Are you okay?" A man's voice called out, panicked. Hesper turned back toward the woods, her chest heaving. The figure was gone. The forest stood still, as if nothing had ever happened. She didn't speak as the man helped her into his car. She couldn't. She just stared out the window, her mind replaying the night over and over again. Hesper never took shortcuts again.